There is a photograph from the 29th of April 2011 that went around the world faster than any royal image since the photograph of Diana Spencer in the transparent skirt taken outside the Young England kindergarten in September 1980. The two photographs share certain qualities that explain their velocity. Both were photographs of young women who had not yet made the formal transition into the royal family's official life. Both captured a quality of physical presence whose effect on the camera was immediate and total. And both arrived at a cultural moment when the appetite for exactly this kind of image was at one of the periodic peaks that the British public's relationship with its royal family reliably generates around the occasions of matrimony and spectacle and the specific promise of dynastic continuation. The 1980 photograph made Diana Spencer the most photographed woman in the world within months of its publication. The 2011 photograph made Pippa Middleton famous in a single morning. The distinction between the two trajectories is as significant as the similarity in the mechanism that produced them. Diana became famous because she was about to marry the heir to the throne, and the photograph was evidence of the desirability that made the heir's choice comprehensible to the watching world. Pippa became famous because she was already wearing a dress that the watching world found impressive, walking in a context that the watching world found absorbing, in a role that required no subsequent explanation or institutional framing to generate the response it generated. She was the maid of honor. Her sister was the bride. The bride was marrying the future King of England, and in the specific arithmetic of attention that major royal occasions produce, some portion of the watching world's focus landed on the maid of honor rather than on the principal and stayed there. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The specific arithmetic requires a moment's attention because it explains something about how the subsequent decade unfolded. The estimated global television audience for the royal wedding of the 29th of April 2011 was somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people. That number represents an unusual condition of simultaneous human attention, a single image experienced by a significant fraction of the world's population at the same moment, producing a single response that the subsequent tracking of social media activity, search volume data, and tabloid sales figures confirmed was broadly uniform in its character. The image was Pippa Middleton, in a white dress, walking through Westminster Abbey. The response was, "Who is she?" The question was answered within hours by a media apparatus that was, by April 2011, capable of answering questions of that kind with remarkable speed and comprehensive coverage. The tabloid press, the celebrity magazines, the internet's biographical aggregators, and the social media platforms that had been building their user bases across the preceding half-decade combined to produce a comprehensive account of who Pippa Middleton was within a news cycle of the question being posed. The account was accurate in its factual particulars. She was Pippa Middleton, the sister of the new Princess of Wales, 27 years old, Edinburgh educated, employed in the family business. What the account could not provide, because it did not exist, was any answer to the question of what Pippa Middleton was going to do with the global recognition that the 29th of April had attached to her, without invitation or institutional preparation. The palace was not prepared for what this meant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The palace had, by April 2011, developed reasonably sophisticated mechanisms for managing almost every predictable category of person who might appear at the periphery of a major royal occasion. It had protocols for managing the families of royal brides, developed through decades of experience with aristocratic marriages and the specific social management that marriages involving the future King of England required. It had protocols for managing the press coverage of royal weddings, refined across the coverage of every royal wedding since the advent of television turned them into global media events. It had protocols for managing the aftermath of royal occasions, the specific institutional work of translating the public warmth of a major celebration into the kind of sustained public affection that the monarchy's long-term institutional health required. What the palace did not have was a protocol for managing a civilian woman who had just become one of the most talked about people on earth through a single morning's visibility, and who was not a member of the royal family, not subject to the palace's communications management, not on any institutional payroll that would have given the relevant people the authority that institutional employment provides, and not, by any reasonable assessment of the situation, the kind of person who could simply be asked to remain invisible until the world's attention moved elsewhere. The specific absence of a protocol was not an oversight in any meaningful sense. It was simply the product of the fact that this particular situation had never arisen before in this particular form. Royal weddings had produced celebrated maids of honor in previous centuries. They had not previously produced them in the age of social media and satellite television, and the 24-hour tabloid news cycle that the specific cultural conditions of April 2011 combined to create. The palace's institutional machinery was built for the world that had existed before those conditions became operative. It was not built for the specific management problem that those conditions produced from a single morning ceremony. The problem required solving, however, whether a protocol existed for it or not, and the solving was conducted across the decade that followed with the tools available, through the specific combination of informal press management, social pressure, and the patient waiting that characterized the institutional management of situations for which formal solutions were structurally unavailable. And so the decade that followed was, among other things, the story of an institutional machinery attempting to manage a challenge for which its tools were inadequate, applied to a person who was never going to be manageable in the ways the machinery required, producing outcomes that the machinery partially contained and partially failed to contain, until the challenge resolved itself through the natural development of a private life rather than through any management operation the institution had conducted. That is the story this account tells. Pippa Middleton was 27 years old on the morning of the royal wedding. She had a degree in English literature from Edinburgh University, completed in 2007. She worked in various capacities in her parents' party planning and supplies business, Party Pieces, the company that Michael and Carol Middleton had built from a kitchen table enterprise in the late 1980s into a reasonably substantial mail-order operation with its own website, its own editorial content production, and an annual revenue that the relevant commercial assessments of such businesses placed in the millions of pounds at the time of the royal wedding. She had begun contributing content to its associated website, providing the party planning editorial that the website's commercial operation required, alongside the product listings that were its primary commercial function. She was, by the accounts of the people who knew her before April 2011, personable, athletic, socially confident in the specific way that a certain kind of English private school education produces in its products, and entirely unknown to anyone outside the social circles she inhabited. The social circles were not negligible in their specific character. The Middleton family had, through the specific combination of commercial success and educational investment that characterized their particular trajectory through the English social world, placed their children in proximity to the upper registers of the English social world in ways that the family's origins did not automatically predict. Michael Middleton came from a family of airline workers and solicitors, professional men of the competent middle class rather than of the landed establishment. Carol Middleton, born Carol Goldsmith, came from a working-class background in Southall that she had moved decisively away from through the combination of social ambition, commercial intelligence, and an eye for opportunity that the subsequent business success reflected in its most concrete form. They married in 1980, moved to Berkshire, and built the party supplies business from a practical observation about a genuine commercial gap. The mail-order market for children's party supplies in the early 1990s was underdeveloped relative to the demand that the middle-class social competition around children's birthday entertainment was generating. Party Pieces filled the gap with sufficient quality and marketing intelligence to grow across the decade into an operation that gave the Middleton children the financial foundation for the private school education that placed them in the specific social world where the subsequent decades of their lives would be organized. The schools mattered for reasons that went beyond the educational curriculum. Marlborough College, the Wiltshire boarding school that both Kate and Pippa attended, was an institution whose alumni occupied a specific band of the English social world, broader than the ancient aristocracy, but considerably narrower than the general English-educated class, organized around the shared experience of the institution and the specific social networks that the shared experience produced. To attend Marlborough was to enter a particular social world with a particular understanding of the institutions, the conventions, and the social currencies of that world. The commercial intelligence that built party pieces was the same commercial intelligence that would shape every significant decision in the Pippa story a generation later. The Middletons were not people who had inherited their position in the relevant world. They had built it, deliberately and methodically, through the identification of opportunities and the consistent application of practical intelligence to the exploitation of those opportunities. The habit of identifying and exploiting opportunities was embedded in the family's understanding of the world across 30 years of successful application, and it did not switch off when the opportunities in question were social rather than commercial, or when the opportunity presenting itself was the global celebrity that a single April morning had attached to their younger daughter. The specific commercial success of party pieces also gave the Middleton children a particular understanding of the relationship between public attention and commercial outcome that was more practically grounded than the understanding available to the children of more conventionally established families. A mail-order business in the Internet age requires ongoing engagement with how visibility translates into commercial activity, how public attention relates to purchasing decisions, how a brand's presence in the relevant market shapes the audience whose attention the brand has attracted. The Middletons understood this relationship with the practical clarity of people who had built a commercial operation from it, rather than the theoretical clarity of people who had studied it from the outside. That practical understanding, transplanted to the specific conditions of Pippa's celebrity, produced responses that were commercially logical within the framework the understanding had been developed in, and institutionally problematic within the framework the palace managed the world through. The translation failure between the two frameworks was not a failure of intelligence on either side. It was the predictable consequence of applying a framework calibrated to one set of conditions to a situation whose conditions were sufficiently different that the calibration was wrong. Pippa navigated the Marlborough world and the Edinburgh world with the specific social ease that her subsequent public profile consistently demonstrated was genuine rather than performed. The accounts of people who knew her at both institutions describe a young woman who was at the center of her social world without appearing to work at being there, who was good company in the specific way that people who find their own company sufficient, and other people's company genuinely interesting, tend to be good company, and who moved through the various social occasions that student life organized around with the natural ease of someone whose physical confidence and social directness made her a reliable social asset in any group context. The Edinburgh years added a different social dimension. The University of Edinburgh's social world at the turn of the millennium contained a significant population of the kind of young people that the relevant English private school world sent north for its university education. People whose social world was substantially the same social world that the same group would subsequently inhabit in London and in the country house circuit of the English social year. Pippa was present in that world with the social ease that her accounts from both institutions consistently confirm was a genuine quality, rather than a performed one. Kate attended the same institution at the same time. The Kate and William relationship developed during the Edinburgh years and in the immediate post-Edinburgh social world of the mid-2000s. Pippa's presence in Kate's social world during those years was the presence of a younger sister who was genuinely close to Kate and who moved through the same social circuit without the specific institutional attention that Kate's relationship with William was beginning to attract. The tabloid surveillance of Kate's social world in the years of the official courtship included incidental coverage of Pippa that established her as a known quantity in the relevant social world without giving her any independent editorial significance. She was Kate's sister. That was her public identity. It was not a public identity that generated its own editorial line. The absence of an independent editorial line was what made the wedding's transformation of her public profile so acute and so institutionally surprising. The people responsible for managing the consequences of major royal occasions had models for what to expect from the people adjacent to those occasions. Models derived from the experience of previous occasions and the patterns of coverage those occasions had generated. The models did not include a scenario in which the maid of honor acquired an independent global celebrity whose scale exceeded the coverage that most formal members of the royal family generated. The absence of a model for the scenario was the absence of a management protocol for its consequences. The distinction between the two sisters was evident even before the royal connection gave it the public significance that the subsequent decades amplified. Kate's social manner was more deliberate, more considered, more oriented toward the kind of careful self-presentation that 20 years of being watched and assessed by the institutional world adjacent to the throne had progressively reinforced. Pippa's manner was more immediate, more oriented toward the social present than toward the management of how the social present would appear from the outside. Kate managed. Pippa participated. The distinction is not a hierarchy. It is a description of two genuinely different orientations toward the social world, shaped by the genuinely different positions that the two women occupied within it. Kate was the one who was going to be queen. The weight of that understanding, present in her formation since the relationship with William became serious, had shaped her relationship with the social world in ways that Pippa's formation had not been required to accommodate. Pippa's social confidence was the social confidence of someone who had never needed to be anyone other than who she was, whose social world had never placed the specific demands on self-management that Kate's world had placed on Kate. This distinction was the source of the specific institutional challenge Pippa represented. The palace's management of Kate had been possible in part because Kate's own formation and her own social intelligence had given her the specific instinct for self-management that the institutional role required. The palace's management of Pippa was not available through the same mechanism because Pippa had not been formed by the same pressures and did not have the same institutional instinct. She was simply herself in the social world, and herself in the social world of April 29, 2011, turned out to be visible to 2 billion people at once. The specific quality of the attention Pippa Middleton received on the morning of the royal wedding requires more careful examination than the standard summary of the event provides, because the examination reveals something about the nature of her celebrity that shaped the entire decade of management challenge that followed. The attention was organized around her physical appearance in a way that went beyond the general interest in the visual dimension of a royal occasion. This is not a controversial observation. The global conversation about Pippa Middleton in the hours and days following the wedding was a conversation almost entirely focused on a specific dimension of her physical appearance. A conversation that the tabloid press in Britain and internationally pursued with an enthusiasm that went considerably beyond the usual coverage of wedding party members, and that produced the kind of sustained, obsessive attention to a single aspect of a person's body that the internet culture of 2011 was making the primary vehicle for a certain kind of instant celebrity. The Facebook page called the Pippa Middleton Ass Appreciation Society accumulated hundreds of thousands of followers within days of the wedding. The name is worth quoting directly, not for any purpose other than to make specific and precise what the phenomenon actually was, because the precision is essential context for the institutional problem the phenomenon created. The palace was managing an institution with centuries of ceremonial history and an approach to the dignity of its members, and the people adjacent to its members, that was organized around the prevention of exactly this kind of public discourse. And it was now required to manage a situation in which the sister of a future queen was the subject of a mass global conversation of this character. The palace's discomfort was real. The management tools available to address it were not adequate to the situation. Pippa was a private individual. She had not sought the attention and had not encouraged it in any meaningful sense. She had worn a dress to her sister's wedding. The global response to the dress was the response of the watching world rather than the product of any decision Pippa had made. The palace's formal position, which was to maintain dignified silence on all matters relating to individuals who were not members of the royal family, was the only position formally available to it. Informally, the conversations that the palace's communications operation conducted with the people whose professional function included the management of press relationships around the royal family's extended social world were conversations that attempted to shape the coverage without being able to direct it. The coverage continued to take the form it was taking. The institutional discomfort continued to be exactly what it was. The inability to direct was the foundational constraint that every subsequent management challenge around Pippa Middleton ran into in one form or another. The palace's management of formal members of the royal family operated through the specific institutional structures of the household, the private secretaries, the official communications functions, the protection officers whose reports created the monitoring infrastructure that formal membership in the institution required. These were instruments of real institutional weight, not simply of suggestion. When the palace required a royal family member to modify their public conduct, the instruments for requiring it were present and operational. Pippa was not subject to any of those instruments. She was employed by her own family's business, not by the palace. She had no private secretary, whose professional function created a direct coordination point with the palace's communications operation. She had no protection officers generating reports that flowed back into the institutional monitoring structure. She was a civilian woman who happened to be the sister of the woman who was about to become the Princess of Wales, and the institutional management of civilians who happened to be related to royals was an area in which the palace's formal toolkit contained nothing more substantial than the informal suggestion and the social pressure that personal relationships made available. The informal instruments warrant examination on their own terms rather than simple dismissal as inadequate, because they were genuine instruments with genuine effects, and the institutional management culture had developed them across decades of managing the adjacent world. The informal conversation between senior members of the palace's communications team and the communications advisors or personal representatives of the relevant adjacent figure was one such instrument. It functioned by creating a shared understanding of what the institutional management preferred and what the consequences of departing from that preference were likely to involve, not in terms of formal sanctions, but in terms of the character of the relationship between the relevant parties and the practical conditions that the relationship shaped. This was a real instrument. It produced real effects in cases where the adjacent figure was embedded in a relationship with the palace that made those effects achievable. The social pressure instrument operated through a different mechanism. It operated through the shared social world that members of the royal family and their immediate adjacent circle inhabited, specifically through the informal signaling that the social world provided about which kinds of conduct were found appropriate and which kinds were found uncomfortable. The relevant signaling was not conducted through formal statements or documented communications. It was conducted through the small social mechanics of the relevant world. The invitations extended and not extended, the warmth expressed at the relevant occasions, the conversation topics that were engaged with enthusiastically, and those that were allowed to lapse. These mechanisms were real. They were the mechanisms of social pressure that had functioned across generations of aristocratic and semi-aristocratic social worlds to produce the conformities that formal mechanisms could not produce. They functioned in cases where the adjacent figure was embedded in the social world in the specific way that made the signals effective. What the Middleton family was, with respect to both instruments, was partially but not completely within reach of them. The family was within reach of the informal conversation, in cases where the relationship channels were open, as they were. It was within reach of the social pressure, in cases where the relevant social signals could be received and acted upon, as they were in some cases. What it was not was subject to these instruments in the same way that the spouses and children of formal members of the royal family were subject to them, because those figures had professional structures, private secretaries, protection officers, palace payroll connections, and the entire institutional architecture that made the informal instruments function as part of a comprehensive management system rather than as isolated gestures in conditions where no comprehensive system was available. The management challenge was, at its most precise, a management challenge produced by a jurisdictional gap in the palace's institutional framework, rather than by any specific failure of conduct on Pippa's part or any specific failure of competence on the management's part. The social pressure was real within the specific world it could reach. The Middleton family was not indifferent to the palace's comfort or to the institutional implications of Pippa's public profile. They understood, with the specific commercial and social intelligence that had built their business and positioned their family in the relevant social world, that the relationship with the palace was the most valuable asset their family possessed, and that the management of Pippa's public profile had direct implications for the value of that asset. The understanding was genuine. The commercial instinct that processed the understanding was also genuine, and the two sometimes pointed in different directions. The year between the wedding and the book's publication was the year in which the specific nature of the management challenge became clear to everyone with an interest in its management. It was the year of the phenomenon at its peak, the period in which Pippa Middleton was among the most searched names on the internet, in which photographs of her at social occasions generated tabloid coverage on a scale that photographs of other private individuals did not generate, and in which the commercial world that surrounds celebrity began to assess the opportunities that her specific kind of fame presented. The commercial assessment was not unreasonable by the standards of the celebrity economy's own internal logic. The scale of recognition was genuinely extraordinary. The name recognition was global and specific, not the vague celebrity of someone slightly famous, but the sharp, immediate, total recognition of someone whose face had been seen simultaneously by 2 billion people in a single morning. By the commercial logic of a world that had learned to extract value from celebrity recognition, this represented a commercial opportunity of considerable potential. The assessment missed the essential character of the recognition. It was recognition organized around a visual moment, a moment so specific and so singular that the recognition it had generated did not naturally extend to any domain beyond the one that the moment had been located in. People knew Pippa Middleton's face. They knew her dress. They knew the occasion on which the face and the dress had appeared. What they did not know, because the single morning had not given them any information about it, was anything about Pippa Middleton's perspective on the world, her expertise in any field, her genuine authority in any domain, or the specific quality of thought or skill or knowledge that might warrant the sustained commercial attention that a publishing proposition requires to convert recognition into sales. The party planning book was announced in 2012 and published in October of that year. The book was called Celebrate, a year of festivities for families and friends, and was published by Michael Joseph, an imprint of Penguin Books, with the marketing support and the commercial positioning that the publisher had committed to the proposition that a book by Pippa Middleton would sell in substantial numbers. The proposition was not frivolous at the time of its formation. The celebrity publishing market had generated commercial successes from people who had become famous through considerably thinner connections to events of genuine public significance. The publisher's assessment was a reasonable application of the commercial logic that the celebrity publishing economy had developed through previous experience, applied to a name that was, by the standard measures of recognition, among the most recognized in the world at the time the publishing deal was made. The proposition collapsed on the specific distinction between recognition and authority that the critics identified with precision in the first days of the book's publication. The reviews were clear. The clarity was not unkind in any personal sense, but was the specific clarity of critics assessing the gap between a commercial proposition's promises and its delivery. The proposition had positioned the book as the social manual of a woman whose access to the highest levels of English social life had given her a unique and valuable perspective on the art of entertaining. The book delivered party planning suggestions of the kind that a moderately well-organized person with access to a good bookshop and a slightly above-average interest in seasonal decoration could have assembled from existing publications without the benefit of Pippa Middleton's specific proximity to Westminster Abbey. The log. The specific suggestion about the decorative use of a hollowed-out log as a centerpiece for a Scottish-themed table setting became, in the coverage of the book's reception, the image around which the critical disappointment condensed. One review deployed the detail with the specific precision of a critic who has found the single observation that does the work of 3 paragraphs of analysis. The observation was that Pippa Middleton's book recommended the use of a hollowed-out log as a centerpiece, and that this recommendation did not obviously require the specific social connections that Pippa Middleton's global fame had suggested she possessed. The hollowed-out log became, in the tabloid grammar of shorthand that celebrity culture applies to the moments that crystallize a public narrative, the symbol of the book's failure. It was a symbol with particular economy. The image of a hollowed-out log encapsulated the critical argument in a form that the relevant publications could use without elaboration, that the social media culture of 2012 could share and comment on with the ease that simple, precise images enabled, and that the subsequent years of coverage about the book would return to as the shorthand that made the argument available at minimum length. The hollowed-out log was the critical reception's contribution to the Pippa Middleton story, and it was a contribution of considerable lasting effectiveness. The commercial performance confirmed what the critical reception had indicated. The book sold substantially fewer copies than the publisher had committed to when the advance was calculated. The specific sales figures were not comprehensively published, but the reporting at the time indicated a gap between the anticipated performance and the actual performance that was sufficiently large to constitute a meaningful commercial disappointment for both the publisher and for Pippa Middleton personally. The Palace's private response to the book's publication is not documented in any form that makes its specific content available with confidence. What is clear, because it reflects the consistent institutional logic that the Palace applied to every situation involving the extended family's commercial activities, is that the book represented exactly the kind of activity that the institutional management of the monarchy's public image found most structurally difficult to accommodate. The difficulty was not about party planning advice as a subject matter. The Palace was not concerned with the content of the book in any direct sense. It was concerned with what the publication of a party planning book by the sister of the future queen communicated about the monarchy's relationship with commercial culture and, more specifically, with the question of whether proximity to the throne was something that could be converted into a publishing advance without that conversion reflecting on the throne itself. The tabloid coverage of the book's launch period answered the question. The coverage consistently situated the book, its author, its subject matter, and its commercial proposition within the frame of the royal connection that gave the proposition its commercial logic. Pippa Middleton, the party planning author, was not separable, in the tabloid coverage's grammar, from Pippa Middleton, the sister of the future queen. The commercial activity drew its commercial rationale from the institutional connection, and the institutional connection was therefore implicated in the commercial activity, regardless of the Palace's preferred account of the relationship between the two. The management of the Celebrate coverage in the period of its publication and the weeks following was the management of a situation that the Palace had been unable to prevent and was now required to navigate through the informal tools of press relationship management that it applied to every sensitive dimension of the royal family's coverage. The navigation was partially successful in the specific sense that the damage was contained rather than amplified, and partially unsuccessful in the specific sense that the damage was real and was not preventable through the management mechanisms available. The publishing episode was the most consequential of the commercial dimensions of the Pippa phenomenon, and it established the pattern that the subsequent decade would confirm. The commercial logic and the institutional logic were not reconcilable within the conditions of Pippa's specific position, and the attempts to reconcile them produced outcomes that satisfied neither framework fully. The broader context in which the book's failure should be understood is the context of the celebrity economy's own evolving relationship with visual fame in the specific period when the Pippa story was developing. The celebrity publishing industry of the early 2010s was operating with commercial models that had been developed in a previous era of celebrity, an era in which the people who became famous through a single visual moment were typically people who had also demonstrated some other quality, some talent or skill or sustained public presence, that gave the fame a secondary justification beyond the specific visual moment itself. The mechanisms of social media and satellite television were in the process of creating a new category of person, the individual who was genuinely globally recognized without any secondary justification beyond the moment of recognition. and the commercial industry around celebrity had not yet developed the analytical tools to distinguish this new category from the categories it had built its commercial models around. Pippa Middleton's situation was the case that tested the inadequacy of the existing models most immediately and most expensively. The publishers applied a model that had worked for celebrities whose fame had a secondary justification, and discovered that the model did not transfer to a celebrity whose fame had no secondary justification, whose recognition was entirely organized around a single visual moment, and who was therefore not in a position to translate the recognition into the kind of authority in a specific domain that a commercial product requires from its author to sell at the volumes the recognition scale had suggested were achievable. The lesson was learned. The party planning book was not republished. The approach that had failed in the specific form of the commercial book was not attempted in that specific form again. The writing that continued after the book took the modest and appropriate form of the contribution to ongoing conversations in publications, whose editorial framing made the contribution's specific scope clear, which was a form that did not overstate Pippa Middleton's authority in any domain, and that was therefore not vulnerable to the specific kind of critical exposure that the overstatement of the book's commercial proposition had produced. Pippa Middleton did not write another book. The social circuit that Pippa Middleton moved through in the years following the royal wedding was the social circuit of the English upper class at its most visible and most photographed level, and she moved through it with a consistency of presence that the tabloid press found reliably generative of content, and that the palace's informal management found reliably generative of management challenges. The circuit had specific geography. It included Wimbledon, where the debenture boxes above Centre Court provided an annual opportunity for photographs of the kind that British tabloids organized their summer royal-adjacent coverage around. It included Ascot, whose Ladies' Day provided the photographic occasion that British fashion and celebrity coverage required an annual replenishment of. It included the various country house weekends and outdoor social gatherings that the English upper-class social calendar assembled across the summer months. The polo at Cirencester and Cowdray Park, the shooting parties that the autumn organized around, and the hunting events that filled the winter social calendar of the relevant world. And it included the international dimension of the social world that Pippa's connections and her global fame made available to her in ways that the domestic circuit did not fully exhaust. The skiing in Verbier, the Swiss resort that the English upper-class social world had adopted as its primary winter gathering point, at the level immediately below the actual aristocracy and the hedge fund billionaires who dominated the very top of the relevant market. The gatherings in Paris, specifically the social world of the French aristocracy and the international social set that orbited it, a world that Pippa's connections through the broader social circuit around Kate and William's world placed her within reach of. The 18 months between the wedding and the book's publication in October 2012 were the months in which the specific character of the management challenge revealed itself in its sharpest form, and in which the people whose professional function included the management of the challenge were required to deal with conditions that their professional formation had not previously encountered. The celebrity that the wedding had generated was, by the middle of 2011, operating at the specific level of saturation that made it a feature of the broader commercial world, rather than simply a feature of the royal coverage. Pippa Middleton's image was being used in advertising contexts without her authorization, a phenomenon that the legal team around her was required to address through the available legal channels. Her name was generating internet search volumes that the analytics companies tracking such things reported with the specific precision of data points that surprised even the people running those reports. Major international publications were requesting interviews, profile pieces, and photographic access with a frequency and a seriousness of commercial intention that the standard celebrity management infrastructure of a formal royal household would have managed through its established protocols, and that the absence of any such infrastructure around Pippa required to be handled through improvised and ad hoc responses. The commercial world that surrounds celebrity responded to the saturation in the way that the commercial world responds to any saturated celebrity signal, by attempting to attach commercial products to the signal before the saturation reduced. The publishing world was the most formally organized of the commercial approaches. The publishers who sought the connection were seeking it at the peak of the recognition, when the commercial logic of the name recognition was at its strongest, and when the argument for a substantial advance was most easily supported by the available metrics of the celebrity's commercial value. The argument had a structural weakness that the metrics did not reveal. The metrics measured recognition. They did not measure the character of the recognition or the domains in which the recognition could be usefully applied. This was the distinction that the commercial assessment missed, and that the critical reception of the resulting product would expose with a clarity that made the exposure almost instantaneous. The palace's communications operation was aware, through the informal channels that kept it in touch with the commercial activities of the extended family's world, that the book was being developed before the publication was announced. The awareness produced the informal expressions of institutional concern that the informal management tools allowed. The expressions were received with the understanding and the acknowledgement that the relevant relationships required. They did not prevent the book from being published because the commercial logic of the publishing deal and the Middleton family's commercial instinct combined to weigh more heavily than the institutional concern that had been informally expressed. The tabloid culture of 2011 through 2014 found Pippa Middleton at any of these locations photographically useful in ways that the tabloid culture's commercial logic made entirely automatic. The name sold newspapers. The face sold digital editions. The photographs of Pippa in a ski suit on a Verbier slope, or in an evening dress at a Mayfair party, or in racing silks at an Ascot box, were photographs that editors knew would drive the kind of reader engagement that the commercial metrics of the tabloid industry had, by the early 2010s, become sophisticated enough to measure precisely. The metrics pointed consistently toward more Pippa coverage rather than less, and the editorial decisions of the relevant publications followed the metrics in the straightforward way that commercial logic drives editorial decision-making when the commercial signal is sufficiently clear. The specific nature of what the commercial metrics were measuring is worth identifying because it clarifies something about why the coverage continued at the level it did across a period considerably longer than the initial photographic occasion would have suggested it could sustain. The metrics were measuring attention. The attention Pippa generated was attention of the specific quality that the visual circumstances of the wedding had produced. Broad, immediate, and organized around a single photographic register. Every photograph of Pippa Middleton in the years following the wedding was, in the commercial logic of the editorial assessment, a renewal of the connection to the original visual moment that the global audience had experienced in April 2011. The renewal was partial and imperfect and diminishing across time, as renewals of unrepeatable occasions always diminish. But it was commercially measurable for longer than the editorial assessment of the coverage's commercial potential might initially have suggested it would remain measurable. The palace's informal press management tools could shape the framing of individual stories. They could not alter the commercial incentive structure that made the stories attractive to produce in the first place. The commercial incentive was the structural force that the management could work around at the margins, but could not eliminate at the center. The practical consequences of being the subject of this specific kind of commercial attention were more significant than the standard account of celebrity coverage suggests. A young woman whose image has become a commercially useful signal for a significant number of major publications is a young woman whose social life is conducted under conditions of photographic surveillance that private individuals in ordinary circumstances do not experience. The surveillance was not legal in any formal sense. British press law was clear enough about the circumstances in which the long-lens photography of private individuals constituted an actionable intrusion. The practice was extensive enough, and the commercial value of the images it produced was sufficient, that the legal frameworks designed to limit it were routinely tested at their edges by publications whose legal departments had calibrated the acceptable risk with the precision that sufficient commercial incentive produces. The specific consequence of this surveillance for the normal social life of a woman in her late 20s was the consequence of living in conditions where the boundary between private and public social occasions was not determined by the nature of the occasion itself, but by the commercial interest of the press in documenting it. A dinner in a Mayfair restaurant could become a tabloid photograph if the photographer outside the relevant location at the relevant time had a long lens and the commercial incentive the publication provided. A country house weekend in Berkshire could generate front-page photographs if someone on the guest list had a phone and a relationship with a publication that paid for such content. The ordinary social life of an ordinary person in an ordinary social world remained, under these conditions, entirely ordinary in every respect except its relationship to the press coverage that the commercial interest in its subject generated from it. Pippa navigated these conditions with the specific social competence that her formation had produced in her, managing the awareness of the photographic environment without allowing the management to transform her social conduct into the kind of managed performance that the institutional formation Kate had received had progressively made Kate's social conduct. The navigation was not perfect. The Paris incident was, among other things, the evidence that even the most socially competent person cannot entirely manage the consequences of a social world in which other people's decisions, specifically the decision of a French aristocrat to point something at a photographer through a car window, generated consequences that the most careful self-management could not prevent. The Paris incident of October 2012 was the international social occasion that became the most acute management challenge of the social circuit period, and it is worth examining in the specific detail that the incident's significance warrants. On what was reported as the 8th of October 2012, Pippa Middleton was photographed in Paris in the company of a group of friends that included Arthur de Saultray, a French aristocrat who moved through the same international social world that her connections at that level of the English social circuit had given her access to. The group was traveling in a car, and in one of the photographs taken through the car window, de Saultray appeared to be pointing a gun in the direction of the photographer who had captured the image. The photograph was published in Paris Match, and from Paris Match it traveled through the global media world with the speed that genuinely surprising photographic content involving recognizable people achieved in the social media environment of 2012. The gun's nature was the first question the coverage organized itself around. Reports at the time indicated that the weapon was a replica, or a toy, rather than a functional firearm, and that the gesture was the impulsive response of a young man who found himself photographed through a car window at the end of a social evening. A response whose specific form, the pointed replica weapon, reflected the specifically French social world's relationship to the theatrical gesture more than any genuine hostility toward the photographer. The context matters for the accurate assessment of what happened. The gesture was foolish. The response produced exactly the image that a foolish gesture in the presence of a long-lens camera produces when the person in the same frame is among the most photographed women in the world. For Pippa Middleton, the image was the institutional problem regardless of what the gun was, and regardless of what the gesture was intended to communicate. The image showed the sister of the future queen in a car in Paris, with a man appearing to point a weapon at a member of the press. The tabloid coverage was immediate, global, and organized around every element of the image that the tabloid grammar found useful. The royal adjacency, the Paris location suggesting a more sophisticated and perhaps more morally complicated social world than the English tabloids preferred to imagine their royals inhabiting. The apparent weapon, and Pippa Middleton, whose name by October 2012 was commercial currency for any publication that could attach it to a front page. The management of the situation operated through the standard tools that the palace applied in conditions where the event itself was unrepeatable, and the management task was therefore the management of coverage rather than the prevention of the event that produced the coverage. The communications operations relationships with the press were deployed. The framing of the incident as a misunderstanding, produced by circumstances that the full context made clear was harmless, was the message the management was organized around communicating. The legal dimension received formal attention from the relevant people whose professional function included the assessment of legal exposure in situations of this kind. The management's partial success was the success of containing the specific consequences of the incident within limits that did not permanently damage the institutional framing of Pippa's position in the royal family's adjacent world. The coverage was acute in its immediate period. It did not sustain at that level of acuity across the weeks and months following the incident in the way that the coverage of genuinely serious institutional damage tends to sustain. The management operation contributed to that reduction, along with the natural news cycle's movement toward subsequent stories and the absence of any developments in the Paris situation that would have provided new material for the coverage to organize around. What the management could not do was make the photograph not exist. It existed. It had been seen. The management of its aftermath was management of the aftermath's intensity, not management of the aftermath's existence. The intensity was reduced somewhat through the management's operation. The aftermath continued. The fundamental problem was that Pippa was living in the world in the way that a 29-year-old woman with social connections and an active social life and friends who made impulsive decisions in cars in Paris lived in the world, and that the living was incompatible with the management requirements that her proximity to the throne generated. The management requirements existed independently of any decisions she made, generated by the institutional logic of the monarchy's relationship with its peripheral world, and by the tabloid press's commercial interest in that peripheral world, and amplified by the global fame that the wedding had produced without any management infrastructure to accompany it. The palace had no tools for making Pippa's social life compatible with those management requirements. The tools were insufficient to the structural incompatibility between what she was and what the management required her to be. The men in Pippa Middleton's life in the period between the royal wedding and her marriage to James Matthews in 2017 generated the specific form of tabloid coverage that the tabloid press organized around the romantic lives of globally famous women, and the coverage had a consistent quality that revealed something important about the specific challenges those men faced. The relationship with Alex Loudon is the one the accounts of the period begin with, partly because it is the relationship that most directly preceded the wedding, and partly because the circumstances of its ending illuminate what the specific challenge of fame of Pippa's particular quality could impose on a private person's existing emotional life. Loudon was, by every available account, a representative of the English upper-class social world that Pippa inhabited. He was from a well-connected family, with its own modest aristocratic associations, educated in the relevant institutions, and had a career in the financial world that was unremarkable in the ways that careers in the financial world at a certain level of connectivity and competence are unremarkable. He and Pippa had been in each other's social world for some time before the wedding, and the relationship was sufficiently established that the wedding preparations assumed his presence in the relevant social context. The timing of the relationship's end, in the weeks or months following the wedding, has been the subject of various accounts in the press coverage of the period, and the accounts agree in their general direction without agreeing in every specific detail. The general direction was that the global fame Pippa acquired through the wedding created conditions in the relationship that the relationship was not designed to accommodate. The privacy that a relationship maintained at a certain level of social discretion requires becomes genuinely impossible to maintain when one party to the relationship has become one of the most photographed people in the world. Every shared social occasion becomes a photographic opportunity. Every photograph becomes a potential tabloid story. Every tabloid story generates coverage that requires response from the people adjacent to it. The management of a private life under those conditions is not simply a practical challenge. It is a fundamental alteration of the conditions under which the private life exists, imposed suddenly and totally by a single morning's global visibility. Alex Loudon had not entered the relationship in conditions where those alterations were either foreseen or chosen. The alterations arrived with a speed and a totality that made the question of whether they were welcome irrelevant, because they were simply the new reality of the situation. The relationship ended. The circumstances were managed with the discretion that the relevant social world imposed on such endings. No detailed public account was provided by either party, which reflects well on both of them and is entirely appropriate as the handling of a private relationship's private conclusion. The specific character of what the fame imposed on the relationship deserves a moment's attention because it is the specific character that the subsequent relationship history repeated in modified form across the next 5 years. The privacy requirement in a relationship between two private people is the requirement that the relationship have a domain in which it exists, outside of external scrutiny. A space in which the two people can be two people, rather than a couple whose relationship is being observed and documented and narrated by a commercial industry, with no access to the actual interior of the relationship and no interest in its actual interior, beyond the extent to which the fragments of externally observable evidence can be assembled into the narrative, forms the commercial interest requires. The global fame destroyed the privacy requirement's practical foundations. The domain ceased to exist. What replaced it was the condition in which every externally observable fragment of the relationship was available to the commercial industry, was available with the specific efficiency that the saturation of photographic documentation had produced, and was assembled into the narrative with the speed and the confidence that the commercial logic drove regardless of the accuracy of the assembly. A man who chooses a relationship with a woman in those conditions is choosing conditions that most people who have not lived in them cannot accurately assess in advance. The men who were in Pippa's life before James Matthews were men who had not lived in those conditions, and whose assessment of whether they could manage those conditions was therefore an assessment made without the evidence that living in them would have provided. The relationship with Nico Jackson, which followed and which developed in conditions where the tabloid documentation of Pippa's social world had become an established feature of the coverage, was a relationship of longer duration and higher public visibility. Jackson worked in the financial world and moved through the same social circuit that Pippa's connections organized her social life around. The relationship lasted approximately 2 years and was, from the outside view available to the tabloid coverage, developing in the direction that the relevant social world expected relationships of that duration between people of that social standing to develop. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tabloid narrative around the Jackson relationship was the romantic trajectory narrative in its most sustained application to the Pippa story. The question of whether the relationship was developing toward marriage was posed in the coverage with sufficient frequency and sufficient seriousness that the question itself became a recurring feature of the coverage, rather than a question that the coverage was waiting to have answered. The question was commercially useful, regardless of whether it was answerable. The commercial interest in the answer sustained the coverage of the question across the months of the relationship's observable duration. The resolution did not arrive in the expected form. The relationship ended in the managed way that the relevant social world's code of discretion shaped, and that the tabloid coverage then assembled from the fragments available to it, without access to the kind of first-hand account that either party would have considered appropriate to provide. What can be observed about both the Loudon and Jackson relationships, without attempting the attribution of specific reasons to either party's decisions, is that they were relationships in which the specific conditions of Pippa's fame imposed requirements that ordinary relationships are not designed to meet. The global visibility. The tabloid documentation. The coordination that her proximity to the palace's institutional world required when aspects of her social life had implications for the royal family's coverage. These conditions came with Pippa as the price of her fame, and the price was paid by the people close to her as well as by her. The condition of being publicly attached to Pippa Middleton in the years between April 2011 and the late months of 2016, when the James Matthews relationship became established, was a condition with specific qualities that the men who experienced it had not anticipated in advance with the accuracy that advance experience would have provided. The tabloid journalism of the period treated the relationships with the thoroughness that any development in Pippa's personal life was guaranteed to receive, which meant that the men adjacent to her were treated not as private individuals going about their private lives, but as supporting characters in the Pippa narrative that the tabloid coverage was continuously generating. Their privacy was not formally removed. It was practically dissolved by the coverage's commercial requirement for material that a globally famous woman's romantic life would always supply more of than her friends' and family's lives would supply. The observation is context rather than explanation. but the context is relevant for understanding the social world within which the eventual arrival of James Matthews in Pippa's life took on the specific significance that the accounts of people who observed the transition consistently attribute to it. The tabloid narrative through which Pippa Middleton's romantic life was covered across those years deserves closer examination than the coverage itself usually receives, because the narrative reveals something about the specific institutional and commercial mechanisms that the palace's informal management tools were most clearly insufficient to address. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The British tabloid press of the early 2010s was an institution that had developed, over decades of covering the royal family and its periphery, a set of narrative conventions for organizing that coverage into forms that its readers found reliably satisfying and that its commercial logic found reliably productive. The conventions were not arbitrary. They were the product of sustained commercial testing across a very large readership, the gradual identification of which kinds of stories generated which kinds of reader engagement, and the progressive refinement of the coverage around the narrative forms that the testing had established as most commercially effective. The narrative form most consistently applied to Pippa Middleton across the relevant years was the form of the uncertain romantic trajectory, the sustained structure of ambiguous romantic development that the tabloid culture found effective precisely because its unresolved character drove sustained reader interest across the weeks and months between the moments of apparent development or apparent setback that the coverage could document through the available photographic and social observation material. The specific mechanism of this narrative form required, for its sustained operation, a subject whose romantic life was both genuinely documented and genuinely uncertain. Pippa provided both the documentation and the uncertainty in the conditions of 2011 through 2016, with a consistency that the commercial logic of the tabloid coverage found ideal. She was sufficiently visible in the social world that the photographic documentation of her movements could generate the sustained supply of images that the narrative required. She was sufficiently uncommitted in her romantic status across much of the period that the uncertainty the narrative required was genuinely present rather than manufactured from ambiguous signals. The palace's informal management tools were least effective in addressing this narrative, precisely because the tools available were tools for shaping the framing of specific incidents and managing the coverage of specific events. They were not tools for addressing the underlying narrative structure that the tabloid coverage was organized around, because the underlying narrative structure was not a product of specific incidents, but of the general condition of Pippa's social and romantic life over an extended period. The management could address the specific photograph. It could not address the general pattern of coverage that the specific photograph contributed to sustaining. The Kate comparison narrative, which ran alongside the romantic trajectory narrative across the same years, was organized through the same commercial logic, but required a different assessment of why the management tools were insufficient to address it. The comparison between the two sisters was a narrative form that the tabloid culture found productive because it gave the coverage of Pippa an interpretive structure that did not depend on any specific event or any specific development in Pippa's own life. The comparison could be generated from almost any available material. A photograph of the two sisters at the same event provided obvious comparison content. A photograph of Pippa alone, compared with archive photographs of Kate at a comparable stage of her life, provided the same content. The narrative was, in this sense, self-generating in a way that the tabloid culture found ideal, requiring only the availability of Pippa's image to sustain itself, rather than requiring specific events of the kind that management could shape or address. The palace found this grammar particularly difficult to address. Its management tools were organized around managing coverage of Kate as a formal member of the royal family, and coverage of Pippa as an adjacent private individual, not around managing the coverage of the relationship between the two women as a competitive structure that the tabloid culture's commercial interests drove it to generate continuously. The tools were not designed for the management of competitive narratives between related individuals at different levels of the institutional world, because the scenario the management tools were designed for did not include this specific configuration of relationships. The genuine relationship between the two sisters, as distinct from the tabloid narrative about it, was a relationship of the kind that the relevant accounts consistently describe. Close in the specific way that the sisters of women who have entered formal institutional life at its highest levels tend to be close, organized around genuine mutual support and genuine mutual affection, and conducted substantially outside the view of the tabloid coverage that constructed its competitive narrative from the available fragments of public visibility. The tabloid narrative bore essentially no relationship to the actual character of the sisterly relationship. The tabloid narrative was organized around what the commercial logic required, rather than around what the available evidence about the actual relationship supported. The management tools could not address this disconnect, because the disconnect was not a specific event, but a structural feature of the tabloid culture's commercial relationship with the material available to it. James Matthews arrived in Pippa Middleton's life through the same social circuit that had produced the Loudon and Jackson relationships, through the specific overlap of the English upper-class social world that places the same relatively small group of people in the same contexts repeatedly across the seasons that organize the social calendar of that world. The skiing world was one of those contexts, and the broader social network that Kate and William's world made available to the people within reach of its periphery was another. Matthews was, in the specific terms that the relevant social world used to assess the people within it, extremely eligible. He came from substantial wealth. He had made more substantial wealth through his own professional work. He had the social pedigree of a particular kind of English world that was significant without being ancient, wealthy without the specific constraints and the specific responsibilities that old money imposes, and connected in the ways that wealth and the right education and the right holiday destinations combined to connect people in the closed social world of the upper English professional class. His family background required some examination before the marriage's institutional implications could be fully assessed. The Matthews family owned Glen Affric Estate in the Scottish Highlands, a significant landholding measured in tens of thousands of acres and representing the kind of property that the English aristocratic and near-aristocratic social world organized its sense of scale and seriousness around. They also had a connection to Eden Rock Villa in St. Bart's, developed as a boutique hotel of the kind that serious money traveled to, and that the social pages of the relevant publications covered, with the frequency that reflected its position at the intersection of genuine aesthetic aspiration and serious wealth. James himself had a professional background that distinguished him in the financial world by virtue of its unusual prelude. Before building his career in fund management, he had been a racing driver, competing in Formula 3 and Formula Ford racing series in the 1990s, with sufficient seriousness that the commitment was a genuine career aspiration rather than a wealthy young man's expensive hobby, and with sufficient capability that the competition was meaningful rather than merely earnest. The racing career ended when the financial career began, and Eden Rock Capital Management, the hedge fund he subsequently built, had achieved the kind of professional reputation that the relevant investment world gave him credit for without qualification. This professional background mattered for the tabloid coverage of the Matthews-Middleton relationship in a way that the professional backgrounds of the Loudon and Jackson relationships had not needed to matter. It provided the ready-made narrative of an interesting man with his own story, which the tabloid culture found considerably more useful than the standard financial world young man narrative that the previous relationships had offered. Matthews had raced formula cars. He ran a hedge fund. His family owned a Scottish Highland estate. These were the raw materials of the kind of profile that the tabloid press could write without difficulty, and that the palace's institutional management found considerably less challenging than the kind of profile that required management of uncomfortable elements. The one element that required the most careful management in the initial coverage of the relationship was James's brother Spencer, who had made his public reputation as a cast member of Made in Chelsea, the Channel 4 constructed reality series that documented the social lives of young wealthy Londoners in the specific part of the city its title named. Spencer Matthews had been one of the program's more prominent cast members and had accumulated the specific kind of notoriety that reality television at that level generated. The notoriety of someone whose private conduct had been documented in a format that made the documentation publicly available. The palace's informal communications operation was not enthusiastic about any sustained narrative connection between the social world adjacent to the future King of England and the specific social world that constructed reality television produced. The connection was not the same as the direct association that James's relationship with Pippa represented, but it was proximate enough to require the kind of careful management of the framing that the relevant press relationships made available. The management was applied. The framing of the relationship in the coverage consistently emphasized James's own professional standing and his family's legitimate place in the relevant social world, rather than dwelling on the reality television dimension of the family's public profile. The emphasis was achievable because the emphasis reflected genuine fact. James Matthews was not a reality television personality. He was a fund manager with a serious professional reputation and a family background that the relevant social world found unambiguously credible. The reality television connection was his brother's connection, not his, and the distinction between the two was one that the press coverage, suitably managed in its framing, could draw and sustain. Spencer Matthews himself made the management considerably easier across the years of the relationship's development than the initial association might have suggested he would remain. He left the reality television world, addressed publicly the issues with alcohol that he has described in his own subsequent accounts, married Morgan McRae, a woman of her own professional accomplishment in the modeling world, and built the kind of post-television life that the tabloid culture found less commercially attractive as content, but that the palace found considerably easier to accommodate as institutional adjacent material. By the time the Pippa and James relationship moved toward its formal conclusion, Spencer Matthews was a substantially different tabloid figure than the Made in Chelsea association had suggested he might remain. The courtship between Pippa and James developed with the specific pace that the social world they both inhabited produced for courtships of its kind. They were in each other's company across multiple contexts over an extended period. Neither party appears to have moved precipitously. The development was gradual in the way that development between two people who are both socially experienced and both operating with the specific awareness of their own positions in the relevant world tends to be gradual. The palace's informal monitoring of the relationship's development was the standard monitoring that the relevant communications function applied to the significant personal relationships of people adjacent to the royal family. The monitoring produced assessments. The assessments of the Matthews connection were, by the standards of the assessments that the preceding relationships had produced, notably positive. James Matthews was the kind of person whose connection to the relevant adjacent world the palace's management could accommodate without the specific management complications that the relevant world's experience of more problematic connections had generated. The professional standing was legitimate. The family background was credible. The specific characteristics that would have triggered the management concerns that the Spencer Matthews dimension had briefly raised were characteristics that James himself did not exhibit. The tabloid coverage of the developing relationship was the coverage that a globally famous woman's romantic progress generated in the specific grammar of the celebrity journalism of the period. The coverage was intensive, as the coverage of Pippa Middleton's social life always was in this period, but it was coverage that the management found more easily shaped toward positive framing than the coverage of the preceding relationships had been. James Matthews's own tabloid friendliness, the result of his professional story and his family's social world, gave the coverage material that it could organize around positively rather than ambiguously, which the preceding relationships had not consistently provided. The engagement was announced in July 2016, 5 years after the royal wedding that had produced Pippa's global celebrity. The announcement was made through the brief formal statement that private individuals with significant public profiles used for such announcements, accompanied by a photograph of the couple that communicated the conventional warmth of such occasions without providing more material than the convention required. The palace's institutional response was the response it had developed for announcements of this kind from people adjacent to the royal family. Warm congratulations communicated through the appropriate channels. press management of the framing, to ensure the coverage reflected the institutional warmth, rather than the tabloid culture's appetite for more complicated narratives, and the specific coordination with the Middleton family that the logistics of a wedding involving the Princess of Wales's sister required. The wedding was held on the 20th of May 2017 at St. Mark's Church in Englefield, a Berkshire village not far from the Middletons' family home. The church was small enough to require careful management of the guest list and the physical arrangements, and both were managed with the specific attention to detail that an occasion involving the sister of the Princess of Wales and her direct connection to the palace's formal institutional world required in practical terms. The church itself, a 12th-century building whose age communicated a particular character about the occasion, was the kind of English country setting that places an event firmly in the register of traditional, private, family-oriented occasion rather than metropolitan social spectacle, and the choice communicated that preference clearly enough that the relevant coverage framed the occasion in those terms from the beginning. The management of the photographic access was the management that a decade of experience with the Middleton family's relationship to the press had refined to its current operational form. The coordinated release of formal official photographs and the management of the physical access points around the occasion gave the global coverage its authoritative photographic material, while ensuring that the uncoordinated press access that had complicated previous Middleton occasions was reduced to the minimum that the available legal and practical tools could achieve. The management operation was, in its specific practical terms, considerably more professionally executed than the management of any earlier major Middleton family occasion, partly because the relevant parties had, by 2017, accumulated substantial experience of what good management of such occasions required and what inadequate management had previously produced. The guest list's most significant formal element was the presence of Prince George and Princess Charlotte in the roles of page boy and flower girl. This gave the occasion its most direct formal connection to the royal family's official world, and, from the tabloid press's commercial assessment, its most valuable photographic content. The images of George and Charlotte performing their ceremonial roles were worth, by any reasonable commercial valuation of royal children in their particular state of adorable seriousness, considerably more to the newspapers than any other photographic content the occasion was likely to generate. The press arrangements were coordinated through the palace's formal communications operation in ways that the presence of royal children in public ceremonies required. The photographic access was managed. The specific framing of the occasion in the coverage was shaped through the channels that the palace's press management made available. The result was coverage that was substantially warmer and more institutionally favorable than the coverage of either the book launch or the Paris incident had been. The photographs of George and Charlotte performing their roles were the images that defined the media day, and those images were exactly the kind that the palace was most skilled at producing and most interested in producing. Pippa walked down the aisle in a white Giles Deacon gown. The comparisons to the Alexander McQueen dress of 6 years earlier were inevitable and were made in every review of the occasion's photographic record, with the frequency that confirmed their inevitability. The comparison was flattering in its terms, which was itself a sign of how substantially the management of the decade between the two occasions had succeeded in replacing the specific character of the 2011 celebrity with something more conventionally manageable. The honeymoon was conducted with the privacy that the Matthews family's specific social world made available to the couple. The Maldives was widely reported as the destination. The tabloid tracking of the couple's movements was less sustained than the pre-wedding tracking of Pippa's movements had been, partly because the occasion that had generated the sustained tracking interest had been formally resolved, and partly because the broader cultural appetite for Pippa Middleton content had entered the natural decline phase that celebrity attention always moves through when the specific occasion generating the attention has been completed. The Matthews marriage was, from the institutional perspective, the most comfortable possible resolution of the management challenge the Pippa phenomenon had represented. The resolution had not been produced by the management operation. It had been produced by the natural development of a private relationship between two private people who had found each other in the social world they shared and had decided to make a formal commitment in the conventional way. the management had not produced this outcome. It had been present across the decade in its informal capacity, containing the most acute consequences of specific incidents and shaping the framing of the coverage in ways that reduced, rather than eliminated, the institutional management challenges. But the resolution of the underlying challenge came from a direction that the management operation could not have produced through its own mechanisms, because the management mechanisms were insufficient to resolve a structural incompatibility rather than a specific incident, and the structural incompatibility required a life development rather than a management intervention to resolve. Arthur Michael William Matthews was born in October 2018, the couple's first child. The announcement was made through the brief formal statement that the relevant social world used for such announcements, and the press coverage was warm and substantial in the way that the birth of a child to the Princess of Wales's sister naturally generated warmth in the tabloid culture that had been covering Pippa Middleton's life for 7 years. The warmth had a different quality than the warmth of the 2011 coverage. The 2011 coverage had been warm in the specific way that the visual attraction dimension of the wedding phenomenon had been warm, organized around the photographic appeal of a beautiful young woman at a spectacular occasion and carrying the specific quality of interest that physical attraction generates in a watching world. The 2018 coverage was warm in the way that the coverage of a new mother is warm in the British tabloid culture, organized around the maternal role that the culture finds both sympathetic and straightforwardly appropriate, and carrying none of the specifically uncomfortable dimensions that the earlier celebrity had carried. A new mother is, in the specific cultural grammar of the British tabloid press's coverage of women in public life, a figure whose public presence is organized around a role that the culture finds genuinely celebratory rather than complicated. The complications that had characterized the peak years of the Pippa phenomenon, the commercial dimension, the social circuit dimension, the specifically visual dimension of the wedding celebrity, had receded. What remained was Pippa Matthews, wife of James Matthews, mother of Arthur, building a domestic life in the world of London and the Scottish Highlands and St. Bart's that the Matthews family's wealth and connections made available. Grace Elizabeth Jane Matthews arrived in March 2021. The birth was announced with the same brief formal statement. The coverage was warm and considerably briefer than the Arthur coverage. The pandemic conditions of March 2021 in Britain had reduced the tabloid press's capacity to generate the contextual photography and social occasion documentation that gave such announcements their usual depth of coverage. The reduced coverage reflected reduced social visibility, under conditions that made social visibility generally unavailable, rather than any reduced warmth toward the Middleton-Matthews family. The third child, Rose Dorothy Matthews, arrived in 2023. The family had grown to 5. The Scottish estate, the London home, the villa in St. Bart's, and the specific social world of the upper English professional class, organized around the resources and the connections that the Matthews wealth made available, had become the stable, conventional, thoroughly uncontroversial domestic life that the tabloid culture of 2023 found insufficiently interesting as content to sustain the level of coverage that the tabloid culture of 2012 had found commercially essential. This was not a failure. It was the resolution of the specific tension between Pippa's civilian life and the institutional management challenges her fame had generated, achieved through the development of the private life rather than through any management operation applied to it from outside. The resolution was the kind that the relevant institutional management preferred and had been unable to produce through its own mechanisms. It was the resolution that came from the development of Pippa's own life in directions that the circumstances of her life had made available to her. 3 children in 5 years represents a specific set of circumstances that the tabloid culture of any decade found less commercially useful as material than the circumstances that had preceded them. The tabloid coverage was not morally required to find the domestic life of a woman raising small children in well-resourced circumstances commercially uninteresting. It simply did, because the commercial interest in celebrity content was an interest in the kind of content that the domestic life of a woman raising small children in well-resourced circumstances could not supply in the volume and the quality that the commercial interest required. The commercial logic was indifferent to the moral dimension of its own conclusions. The conclusion it reached was the one the institutional management had been hoping it would reach since approximately November 2011. The transformation of Pippa's public presence across the years of the children's early lives was a transformation that the palace had not produced through management, but that the natural conditions of the domestic life the marriage had created were producing through their own logic. A woman raising young children in the conditions of the upper English professional class has substantially reduced public visibility compared to a woman who is single, globally famous, and living the social circuit life that a certain kind of international wealth and connection generates. The reduced visibility was not the product of any institutional pressure applied to Pippa to live more quietly. It was the product of the private life she was living, which happened to be a life whose conditions made the kind of public presence that the preceding decade had generated unavailable as a practical matter. The fitness activities continued, because fitness had been a genuine feature of her life before the wedding, and remained genuine afterward. She ran the London Marathon in 2014 for charity, completing it in a time that the coverage noted with appropriate acknowledgement of the physical commitment the training had required. The marathon itself, as a public event involving a genuinely large field of runners and therefore not susceptible to the kind of managed photographic access that private occasions could arrange, was an event in which Pippa Middleton ran through the streets of London among thousands of other runners and was photographed doing so with the freedom from the managed access conditions that the event's public character made available to the press. The images from the marathon were, in the specific editorial judgment of the publications that ran them, some of the most straightforwardly positive images in the whole corpus of Pippa Middleton tabloid photography. The context provided the most unambiguously favorable framing available: a woman running a significant physical distance for a charitable purpose, in conditions that bore no relationship to the specifically visual and specifically social character of the celebrity that the royal wedding had generated. She participated in the Vasaloppet, the Swedish cross-country ski race of 90 kilometers that is among the more demanding endurance events available to amateur competitors, and in various other sporting challenges across the years of the post-wedding period. The Vasaloppet in particular was coverage of a specific kind: a British woman, recognizable by name and face to the relevant international readership, completing a serious amateur endurance event in conditions that were photographically beautiful in the way that Scandinavian winter landscapes tend to be photographically beautiful. The coverage the Vasaloppet generated was the coverage of genuine physical achievement in an unusual setting, and it produced the warm, admiring coverage that genuine physical achievement combined with unusual setting tends to produce. The participation in these events was covered in the press with the warmth that the tabloid culture extends to physical challenges undertaken by public figures for charitable purposes, which is the most unambiguously favorable framing available in the tabloid grammar of celebrity coverage. The fitness activities and their charitable dimension were the dimension of Pippa's post-wedding public profile that came closest to the kind of public role that the palace's management of the royal family's extended world could accommodate most comfortably. Physical challenges for charity combined the visibility that any sustained public presence requires with a moral framing that the institutional management could endorse without discomfort. They did not raise the commercial positioning questions that the book had raised. They did not generate the social occasion complications that the Paris incident had generated. They were, in the specific institutional grammar of what the palace found comfortable about the extended family's public activities, about as comfortable as any form of public visibility could be. The writing continued in reduced form. Pippa contributed fitness and lifestyle columns to various publications in the years following the book's disappointing reception, and the columns provided a public presence that was considerably easier to manage in institutional terms than the book had been. A column is a contribution to a conversation rather than a claim to authority. A column carries none of the commercial positioning that a major publisher's investment signals. The distinction mattered because the institutional management of what Pippa's public activities communicated about the royal family's peripheral world was sensitive to the commercial ambition of those activities in a way that it was not sensitive to the more modest and conventionally appropriate ambition of a newspaper column. The columns were, in their specific quality, a more accurate representation of what Pippa Middleton actually was than the book had been. She was someone with genuine interest in physical fitness, a practical orientation toward the domestic and social dimensions of the life she was living, and a writing voice that was direct and unadorned in the way that people who are not primarily writers, but who have something specific to say, tend to be direct and unadorned. The directness was genuinely hers. The book had packaged it in a commercial proposition that the commercial framing required and that the critical reception found inadequate. The columns presented it in a context that it fit without strain. The decade between the royal wedding and the consolidation of the Matthews domestic life produced, in its specific combination of commercial miscalculation, social complication, tabloid excess, and eventual conventional resolution, a case study in the specific institutional management challenge that has no clean precedent in the modern history of the British royal family. The challenge had a structure worth articulating with some precision, because the precision reveals why the palace's management tools were inadequate to its resolution, and why the resolution came from a direction the management operation could not have produced. The British monarchy has developed, across the course of its modern history, sophisticated mechanisms for managing almost every predictable category of person whose proximity to the throne generates public attention. Formal mechanisms exist for managing the immediate family members of the sovereign, operating through the household structure, the private secretaries, and the official communications function. Less formal but still operative mechanisms exist for managing the more distant family members, the cousins and aunts and uncles who carry royal titles but perform reduced institutional functions, through the cultivation of the press relationships that shape the coverage of the peripheral royal world, and through the social pressure that the institutional world can apply to people who depend on it for significant dimensions of their social and professional standing. Mechanisms exist for managing the household staff through the professional structure of employment and the code of discretion that employment enforces. Mechanisms exist for managing the press itself through the formal press office and the informal relationships that decades of careful cultivation have built between the palace's communications operation and the journalistic world that covers the royal family. What does not exist, and what the Pippa Middleton phenomenon revealed in stark form, is any adequate mechanism for managing the civilian sibling of the heir's spouse, whose fame has been generated by a single television appearance at a royal occasion, and whose subsequent public profile is the product of that fame, operating in the tabloid culture without any of the institutional infrastructure that would make the profile manageable through the palace's standard tools. The civilian sibling who has not been formed by institutional life and is not subject to institutional employment is a category of person for whom the management toolkit provides only informal instruments. The informal instruments available are social pressure, which can be applied through the personal relationships the family and the palace's advisors maintain with the relevant individuals, and the management of press relationships, which can be shaped through the cultivation of the relevant journalistic world to produce coverage that serves the institutional interest rather than complicating it. Both instruments are real. Both produce real effects. Neither is adequate to the specific management challenge that the global fame of a civilian sibling generates in the tabloid culture of the early 21st century, because the global fame operates through mechanisms that the palace's informal press relationship management was not designed to manage, and that the social pressure instrument has insufficient authority to constrain. The social pressure can suggest to Pippa Middleton that a party planning book might not serve the institutional interest. It cannot make the commercial logic of publishing such a book less persuasive to a family with 30 years of commercial experience, telling them that the commercial logic is sound. The press relationship management can shape the framing of the book's coverage in the outlets whose relationship with the palace's communications operation has been cultivated over time. It cannot prevent the outlets that have no cultivated relationship from covering the critical reception with the editorial freedom that independence from the management enables. The management could contain the most acute consequences of the institutional problem Pippa represented. It could not resolve the structural incompatibility between what Pippa was and what the palace's institutional management of its peripheral world needed the people adjacent to it to be. The structural incompatibility was not a failure of either Pippa's conduct or the palace's management. It was the product of conditions that neither party had chosen. Pippa's global celebrity, the commercial instincts of a commercially formed family, and the palace's institutional management framework, built for a world in which these conditions had not previously combined in this specific form. The specific form of fame that the royal wedding generated for Pippa Middleton had no real precedent in the combination of its characteristics, and the absence of precedent was the source of both the institutional management challenge and the commercial miscalculation of the publishing proposition. The fame was not the fame of achievement. It was not the fame of sustained public presence in a field that generates its own celebrity through the quality of work or the consistency of public engagement. It was the fame of a single visual moment, experienced simultaneously by approximately 2 billion people, that produced an immediate and total recognition, carrying none of the usual signals about what the recognition was for or what the recognized person was actually like, beyond the visual terms of the specific moment that had generated it. The celebrity economy of the early 21st century had developed, through the specific mechanisms of social media and international tabloid culture, the capacity to generate this kind of fame with a speed and totality that earlier eras of celebrity had not matched, and that the industries built around the monetization of celebrity had not fully adjusted to managing. The book publishing industry's assessment of what the Pippa Middleton name could deliver commercially was an assessment based on the scale of the recognition, without adequate attention to the specific quality of the recognition. 2 billion people had seen Pippa Middleton at the royal wedding. Very few of them had seen her do anything that would give a party planning book the intellectual or social authority that the scale of the recognition might, in a more straightforwardly connected celebrity economy, translate into commercial success. The distinction between the scale of the recognition and the authority the recognition conveyed was the distinction the publishers had not adequately made, and that the critical reception made immediately apparent. The celebrity economy's subsequent development across the years following the Pippa phenomenon suggests that the miscalculation was not unique to her situation. The specific challenge of translating the fame that viral moments produce into sustainable commercial products has generated a substantial body of cautionary commercial experience in the years since, as successive individuals who have become globally recognized through single moments of extreme visibility have discovered that the extreme visibility does not automatically convert into the kind of sustained audience engagement that commercial products require. Pippa Middleton's situation was an early example of a phenomenon that became considerably more common and considerably better understood in the years that followed. She was famous in a way that the celebrity industry was not yet fully equipped to manage, and the management failures of the specific commercial products that the industry generated from her fame were the management failures of an industry learning, in real time and at her specific expense, the distinction between fame and authority. The broader cultural obsession with her appearance, specifically the visual dimension of the famous photograph that had generated the immediate global recognition, was the element of the fame that the commercial products could not straightforwardly incorporate, because the commercial products that proximity to the throne could credibly support were not the commercial products that the physical dimension of the celebrity suggested. The fame was physical, the commercial opportunity was institutional. The two pointed in different directions, and the space between them was where the commercial miscalculation of the party planning book was made. The Kate comparison was the other persistent dimension of the Pippa phenomenon that the tabloid coverage of the decade organized itself around, and that the institutional management of the palace found consistently challenging to navigate. The comparison was inevitable given the structural relationship between the two sisters, but its specific character in the tabloid coverage of the post-wedding period was a character shaped by specific commercial interests of the tabloid culture, rather than by any honest assessment of the two women's actual similarities and differences. The similarities that the tabloid comparison organized itself around were largely superficial. Two women of similar age, similar formation, similar social world, similar physical bearing in the broad sense that sisters from the same family with similar formation tend to share. The differences that the comparison consistently elided were more significant. Kate had been formed, over a decade of her relationship with William, and the institutional world his position required engagement with, into a public figure whose public conduct was the product of sustained institutional training and sustained personal adaptation to institutional requirements. Pippa had been formed by nothing of the kind. The comparison between the two women's public profiles therefore compared products of entirely different formation processes, as if the processes were equivalent, which they were not. The tabloid comparison was commercially useful precisely because it was not accurate. An accurate comparison would have required acknowledging the formation difference, and acknowledging the formation difference would have made the comparison considerably less commercially productive than the version that ignored it. The competitive narrative required that the two women be competing in the same domain on equivalent terms. The acknowledgement of the formation difference would have removed the equivalence of terms and therefore removed the competitive character of the narrative that the commercial interest required. The tabloid comparison between Pippa and Kate operated through a specific grammar of sisterly competition that the tabloid culture applied with automatic regularity to any two women in proximity to each other who could be positioned as rivals, whether or not any rivalry existed in any meaningful sense. Kate was the princess. Pippa was the sister. The tabloid culture's grammar required that the relationship between them be organized around comparison, around the assessment of who was doing better at what, around the specific competitive framing that the culture found commercially useful, regardless of its accuracy, as a description of the actual relationship between two sisters, who by all available evidence were genuinely close and genuinely supportive of each other. The palace found the comparison grammar particularly difficult to manage because its management tools were organized around managing coverage of Kate as a formal member of the royal family and coverage of Pippa as an adjacent private individual, not around managing the coverage of the relationship between the two women as a competitive structure that the tabloid culture's commercial interests drove it to generate continuously. The management tools were not designed for the management of competitive narratives between related individuals at different levels of the institutional world, because the scenario the management tools were designed for did not include this specific configuration of relationships. The genuine relationship between the two sisters, as distinct from the tabloid narrative about it, was a relationship of the kind that the relevant accounts consistently describe. Close in the specific way that the sisters of women who have entered formal institutional life at its highest levels tend to be close, organized around genuine mutual support and genuine mutual affection, and conducted substantially outside the view of the tabloid coverage that constructed its competitive narrative from the available fragments of public visibility. The two sisters attended the same events. They were photographed in the same contexts. The tabloid coverage of those photographs organized itself around the specific competitive grammar, regardless of what the photographs actually showed, because the competitive grammar was what the commercial interest required the coverage to provide. The management of the coverage was the management of the specific outlets where the cultivation of press relationships made the management possible, which was not all of them and sometimes not the most commercially significant ones. The honest account of what the Pippa Middleton story reveals about the British royal family's institutional management of its peripheral world requires separating what the palace did, what it tried to do, and what it was structurally incapable of doing, regardless of what it tried. What the palace did was manage. It managed through the informal instruments its function made available, with the competence and consistency that the relevant professional culture had developed across decades of similar work. The Paris incident was managed. The book's commercial disappointment was managed at its coverage margins. The tabloid coverage of the romantic relationships was managed at the edges where the management tools could reach. None of the specific incidents produced the kind of permanently damaging narrative that might have complicated the institutional management of Kate's role or William's public profile in serious ways. That is the measure of the management's partial success. What the palace tried to do, in the informal conversations and the social signals and the gentle institutional pressure that the relevant channels made available, was to shape Pippa's public profile toward the form that the institutional management of the monarchy's adjacent world preferred, which was the form of quiet, conventional, socially appropriate presence that the wives and sisters of the relevant world had traditionally maintained in the background of the institutional picture, without generating their own independent editorial lines in the tabloid coverage. The preference was, in institutional terms, entirely comprehensible. The people in the palace's adjacent world, who maintained the quiet, conventional, socially appropriate presence that the institutional management preferred, were people whose public profile required essentially no management. They appeared at the required occasions with the required degree of warmth and propriety. They maintained their social world in conditions that did not generate the kind of tabloid coverage that required management responses. They were, from the institutional management perspective, people who cost essentially nothing to manage and whose continued presence in the adjacent world was entirely compatible with the institutional management of the monarchy's core public image. The institutional preference for this profile was not snobbery or the imposition of class hierarchy. It was the preference of a management operation for the conditions that minimized management requirements. The trying was management applied to a situation for which the tools available were insufficient to the task. The commercial instincts of the Middleton family, the global fame the wedding had generated without institutional sanction or infrastructure, the tabloid culture's commercial interest in Pippa Middleton content, and Pippa's own independence from the institutional framework that would have made the trying more operationally effective, all combined to produce outcomes that satisfied neither the commercial logic nor the institutional management logic fully. What the palace was structurally incapable of doing, regardless of the competence of the management or the good faith of the attempting, was making Pippa Middleton subject to the institutional management framework that made the management of formal members of the royal family's world achievable. She was a civilian. She had no private secretary whose professional function created a direct coordination point with the palace's communications operation. She had no protection officers generating reports that flowed back into the institutional monitoring structure. She was a citizen of a free country who happened to be the sister of a woman who was about to become a princess, and the specific management of citizens who happened to be related to royals was an area in which the palace's formal toolkit contained nothing more substantial than informal suggestion and social pressure. The structural incapacity was not a failure of design in any meaningful sense. The palace was not designed to manage this specific situation, because the specific situation had not arisen in this specific form before the mechanisms of modern celebrity culture, combined with the global reach of satellite television, to produce it from a single Westminster Abbey procession on an April morning. The design will need adjustment. The future development of the royal family's adjacent world will produce similar situations as the mechanisms of global celebrity culture continue to generate the kinds of immediate, total, visually organized fame that the wedding generated for Pippa in ways that the institutional world has no prior experience managing. The Pippa problem was a preview of a challenge that will recur in different forms as the institution's extended family continues to expand and the celebrity mechanisms continue to operate on the occasions that family creates. The specific lessons of the preview are worth stating: that civilian fame generated by royal occasions is a category of fame the palace's informal management tools are insufficient to contain. That the commercial instincts of commercially formed families are not adequately managed by social pressure applied through royal connection, and that the specific visual dimension of fame generated by royal wedding occasions is a dimension the institutional world finds most difficult to channel into the forms of public presence it finds most comfortable. These lessons have not been formally articulated by the people whose professional function includes the drawing of lessons from specific management challenges in the palace's institutional history. The palace does not produce formal accounts of its management failures. It produces the managed continuation of the institutional machinery that the challenges have required adjustment to, and it waits for the time and the distance that eventually make the honest accounting less immediately costly. The life that Pippa and James Matthews built after the wedding of May 2017 was, in its specific character, the life that the palace had informally hoped the marriage would produce. The institutional management challenge that Pippa's celebrity had represented across the preceding years called for a resolution of this kind, a conventional domestic life whose conditions were incompatible with the sustained public visibility that the tabloid coverage required to sustain its commercial interest. The marriage provided those conditions. The domestic life followed. The tabloid culture's interest reduced. The resolution was genuine. The domestic life was real, not performed. The accounts of the people close to Pippa and James across the years of the children's early lives describe a woman who was genuinely engaged with what she was building and genuinely uncomplicated in her relationship with the reduced tabloid attention that the building produced. She was not a person who found the withdrawal from public visibility difficult in the way that people formed by public visibility sometimes find it difficult. She had not been formed by it. She had been subjected to it for a period that the specific circumstances of the wedding had made unavoidable, and when those circumstances changed and the unavoidability reduced, the reduction was not something she found it necessary to resist or to compensate for through the cultivation of alternative sources of the attention she had not sought in the first place. The distinction between people formed by public visibility and people subjected to it is a distinction that the Pippa story clarifies more than most celebrity narratives clarify it. The people formed by public visibility are people whose sense of themselves and their place in the world has been shaped, across the time that the visibility has been present, by the conditions of being visible, by the audience, by the coverage, by the management of the relationship between self-presentation and public response. The withdrawal of those conditions from people formed by them tends to generate the responses of loss and disorientation that the accounts of celebrity decline often describe. The people subjected to public visibility are people whose self-formation happened outside those conditions and who experience the visibility as an external imposition rather than an internal condition. The withdrawal of the imposition tends to produce relief rather than loss. Pippa Middleton was 27 years old when the April 2011 morning made her globally visible. Her formation as a person had happened across the 27 years before that morning, in the conditions of the Berkshire and Edinburgh social world and the Marlborough and Edinburgh University formation that had produced the specific social confidence and the practical athletic intelligence that her subsequent public profile consistently demonstrated were genuinely hers. The global celebrity attached to those existing qualities from outside. It did not produce them. When the global celebrity reduced, the existing qualities remained. The woman who had them was still there, somewhat older, somewhat more experienced, considerably more settled in the domestic life she had built, and essentially unchanged in the character that the 27 years before April 2011 had formed. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, something fairly important about what the decade of the Pippa phenomenon illuminates about the relationship between personal formation and the specific conditions of early 21st century celebrity. The tabloid culture moved on, in the way that tabloid cultures move on from subjects who stop generating the kind of content that the commercial logic requires. The commercial logic required drama, complication, the kind of social world visibility that produced the photographic opportunities and the romantic narrative content that the relevant editors found commercially useful. The domestic life of a woman raising 3 children in Kensington and on a Scottish Highland estate generated none of those things in the required volume. The commercial logic pointed elsewhere, to other subjects generating the required content in the required volume. And the tabloid coverage of Pippa Middleton reduced to the level of the occasional appearance at a relevant occasion, photographed with the warmth that the relevant editorial position toward the Middleton family had established as appropriate. The palace, conducting its institutional management of the peripheral royal world through the standard informal instruments that the standard management situation required, found the Pippa situation considerably more comfortable in 2023 than it had been in 2012. The comfort was genuine. It was also the comfort of a management challenge that had resolved itself rather than one that the management had resolved. Pippa Matthews, as she has been since May 2017, is a woman in her early 40s living a life that the tabloid culture has largely concluded is not generating sufficient content to sustain the level of coverage that the tabloid culture of 2012 found commercially essential. The observation is not a criticism. It is a description of the specific pattern of the relationship between celebrity culture's commercial appetite and the kinds of lives that eventually fail to satisfy that appetite, because they have resolved into a conventional domesticity that the celebrity culture finds insufficient as raw material. The life she is living is one that the relevant social world around her would regard, by every measure of what it considers a life well organized, as genuinely successful. 3 children, growing in the specific combination of London and the Highlands and the international world that the Matthews family's resources made available. A husband whose professional standing was solid before the marriage and has remained so. A domestic world that was built from the foundations of both families' commercial success and social connection into something that needed to be neither performed nor managed to sustain its own coherence. The charitable sporting activities remained a genuine feature of her life, pursued with the physical seriousness that her pre-wedding athletic involvement had established as authentic. The writing continued in the modest form that columns and contributions represented. The presence at the relevant family occasions, the occasions that Kate's position required family attendance at, and that Pippa's position as Kate's sister made her a natural participant in, continued with the warmth and the discretion that the institutional situation around those occasions required. The palace found all of this about as comfortable to manage as anything involving the extended family's peripheral world ever is to manage, which is considerably more comfortable than the preceding decade had been. The management challenge reduced from an acute institutional problem requiring sustained informal management resources to the normal background management requirement of an institutional world that always has some dimension of its peripheral coverage to shape. The distance between the April 2011 phenomenon and the mid-2020s conventional domesticity is the full span of the Pippa Middleton story. And the traveling across that span illuminates more than the specific trajectory of one woman's relationship with fame and its management. It illuminates something about how the celebrity economy of the early 21st century functioned at its edges, where the recognition outran the authority, and where the commercial industries built to monetize recognition discovered that the two quantities were not the same and were not automatically interchangeable. The mass broadcast era had produced celebrities whose recognition was built through sustained exposure in specific domains. Actors who were recognized because they had been seen in many films across many years. Musicians whose recognition was built through a sustained output of recorded and performed material. The recognition carried with it an implied authority in the relevant domain, an implied demonstration of continued capacity that gave the commercial translation of the recognition its foundation. The specific fame that the royal wedding generated for Pippa Middleton was fame organized around a single visual moment in a context that was not hers to repeat. The recognition was real. The authority it implied was undemonstrable. The commercial industries that attempted the translation discovered the undemonstrability at cost. The tabloid press of the period also illuminates something through its decade of sustained Pippa coverage, which is the specific quality of the commercial interest that visual celebrity generates in the relevant industry when the visual occasion cannot be repeated, and the celebrity therefore cannot be renewed from its original source. The coverage that sustained itself across the decade was coverage organized around the commercial production of substitute material. The romantic narrative, the sister comparison, the social circuit documentation, the charitable achievement, the domestic milestone. Each of these was a substitute for the unrepeatable original visual moment, a way of sustaining the commercial interest in the name and the face in conditions where the original interest-generating occasion could not be revisited. The substitutes worked imperfectly, which is why the coverage reduced across the decade rather than sustaining itself. The imperfect working was inherent to the character of the original fame and could not have been corrected through better management of the substitutes. What nobody managed was the essential simplicity of the situation. Pippa Middleton was a private person who had been subjected to a level of public attention that private persons are not designed to manage, and who, given time and the right personal circumstances, would resolve the attention's most demanding consequences through the natural development of a private life, rather than through any management operation applied to the situation from outside. The resolution happened, the private life developed, the management challenge reduced. The tabloid culture found other subjects. And Pippa Middleton, who had been the sister nobody could control because nobody had the tools to control her, and because controlling her had never been the right response to a situation the controlling instinct had not created, went home. The year Pippa Middleton walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, the social media platforms that would become the primary vehicle for the specific kind of fame her appearance generated had been in existence for a handful of years. The mechanisms of instantaneous global celebrity that those platforms enabled were new enough that nobody involved in managing the occasion had adequately modeled their potential to generate precisely the kind of uncontrolled celebrity outcome that the management subsequently spent years attempting to contain. The Facebook Appreciation Society, that appeared within hours of the ceremony's conclusion and accumulated its initial membership across the day of the wedding, was a mechanism of celebrity generation that the British royal family's institutional management had no model for addressing because the mechanism had not previously existed in the form it had taken by April 2011. The palace's press management operation was an operation developed across decades of managing the relationship between the royal family and the traditional print and broadcast media. The digital media's operation through social platforms rather than editorial structures meant that the management tools calibrated for the relationship with traditional media were tools whose reach stopped at the boundary of the editorial world, and whose effect on the social media dimension of the coverage was minimal. The decade that followed was a decade in which the relevant institutions learned, through the specific experience of attempting to manage the unmanageable, something about the limits of their own tools. The palace learned the limits of informal management, applied to civilian fame of the scale that the digital celebrity mechanisms of the early 2010s could generate from a single visual moment. The publishing industry learned the limits of commercial celebrity translation, without substantive authority. The tabloid press learned the limits of the sustained commercial interest that visually organized celebrity generates when the visual occasion that generated it cannot be renewed. The specific lesson for the palace's institutional management operation was the lesson of the jurisdictional gap. The palace could manage the coverage of its formal members with the tools it had developed for exactly that purpose. It could manage the coverage of the civilians adjacent to those formal members only with the informal instruments that informal relationships provided, and the informal instruments were sufficient for the normal conditions of civilian adjacency, but insufficient for the specific conditions that global digital celebrity had created. The gap between what the formal tools could achieve and what the informal tools could achieve was the gap that the Pippa story inhabited across its most complicated decade. The lesson has institutional implications for the management of future occasions involving the same combination of characteristics. A major royal event of global broadcast reach, a civilian in a role that places them visually in front of the broadcast, and the digital celebrity machinery of the social media world, waiting to process whatever visual material the broadcast provides. These conditions have existed at every major royal occasion since 2011. The management of them has been informed, one assumes, by the specific experience of managing their consequences from the morning after the wedding of the 29th of April 2011 onward. Pippa Middleton learned something too, or confirmed something she perhaps already understood, which is that the fame that arrives uninvited and without institutional support resolves most effectively not through the management of its public dimensions, but through the development of the private life that the public dimensions cannot sustain their purchase on indefinitely. The private life gets built. The public fame reduces. The management challenge becomes manageable. The institution spends a decade learning there was nothing it could do about any of this that it was not already doing. That is the institutional lesson. Pippa was never particularly interested in the institutional lesson. She was living her life. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.